What kind of woman lies down willingly beneath a wooden door and lets the weight of the kingdom crush the breath from her chest? What kind of mother, barefoot, bruised, barely over 30 years of age, refuses to speak a single word in her own defense? Not because she is guilty, but because she knows that silence is the only way to protect the people she loves. This is not a tale spun in darkness to scare children. This is a historical fact. This happened in England, in the stone-grey city of York, in the year of our Lord 1586. And the woman's name, the name they tried to erase from history, was Margaret Clitherow. She was not born into power, not cloaked in royalty, not trained in politics or war. She was a butcher's wife, a mother of 3, a convert to the forbidden faith of Catholicism in a kingdom ruled by Queen Elizabeth I, where such belief was not only considered dangerous, it was treason. In a time when hiding a priest was punishable by death, Margaret turned her own home into a sanctuary. She didn't carry a sword or wear armor, but she fought every single day with nothing but her rosary and her refusal to back down. It began slowly. Like all tragedies do, the laws crept in after the schism with Rome. Priests were hunted like criminals. Mass was outlawed. Confession had to be whispered, if at all. Margaret, newly converted and burning with belief, didn't flinch. She opened hidden spaces in her home for priests to sleep. She taught children catechism in secret. She risked everything not because she was reckless, but because she understood the risk and walked straight into it anyway. For years, she lived under threat. The men in black cloaks came often. Her home was searched. Her husband, John, who stayed Protestant for survival, paid her fines, begged her to stop, watched helplessly as she went deeper. But Margaret knew the game, and she also knew that the silence of compromise was a louder betrayal than the noise of resistance. Eventually, they came not with questions but with charges. They found her hiding place. They found evidence she could not deny. And so they took her. The trial was set, and here's where her story twists into something most people today still cannot understand. Margaret did not plead innocent. She did not plead guilty. She refused to plead at all. Because in the law of the land, if you refuse to enter a plea, there could be no trial, and no one could be forced to testify against you, not even your children. So Margaret, with the full knowledge of what it meant, sealed her own sentence with silence. The punishment for such refusal was ancient, almost forgotten, reserved for the most stubborn of traitors. It was called peine forte et dure, strong and hard punishment, first used in England centuries before. It meant death by crushing. You would be laid on the ground. A heavy door would be placed on your body, and then stone by stone, weight would be added until your ribs broke. Your lungs collapsed, and you suffocated slowly. Margaret knew. They told her clearly. She nodded. She would not plead. The town was horrified. Even those who hated Catholics hesitated. She was a woman, a mother, the wife of a respected tradesman. Some begged the Queen for mercy. Others asked her to just say a single word to save herself. But Margaret would not. Not out of pride. Not out of foolishness. But because she understood that her silence would mean her children would never be dragged into court to betray her. Her neighbors would not be punished. Her friends would not be hunted. She would carry the weight alone. And so on the morning of March the 25th, 1586, Margaret Clitherow walked barefoot to the execution chamber beneath the toll booth on Ouse Bridge. It was not a scaffold. There was no crowd. Not trumpet. No final speech. There was only straw, stone, and silence. She lay down. A door was placed across her. Her hands were outstretched in the shape of a cross. She asked only for a stone to be placed beneath her back. To lift her heart to heaven, they placed the first weights, then more, and more. It took 15 minutes. Not a scream, not a cry, only breath. Then silence. Then nothing. They buried her in secret, beneath the dirt, beneath shame, beneath the hopes that no one would ever speak of it again. But Margaret's silence was louder than any verdict. Her refusal became legend. Her faith became fuel, and the woman they tried to crush into dust became, over time, a saint. In the centuries that followed, people began to whisper her name again. In 1984, nearly 400 years after she was murdered, the Catholic Church canonized her, Saint Margaret Clitherow, the Pearl of York. But before she was a saint, before she was a legend, she was a woman, tired, brave, and painfully human, who chose to be crushed alive rather than break her silence. And that is where this story truly begins. Before Margaret Clitherow was a martyr, before she was a name whispered in candlelit chapels and etched into the memory of saints, she was simply a woman living in a crooked, on the cold city, walking the stone streets of York with a basket in her hand and a question in her heart that would not leave her alone. It was not the question of whether the crown could rule over the soul, nor whether Rome still mattered in a country that had broken from it decades earlier. It was something softer, stranger, more dangerous. She wanted to know what it meant to feel truly forgiven, not by a judge in a court, nor by a law in Parliament, but by the God she feared and loved and longed to understand. In those days, the Church of England was clean and new, like a skin still healing over a wound. But to Margaret, the Protestant sermons sounded like law, and the law sounded like power, and the power always seemed to serve men, not heaven. She was born in the year 1534, in a time when the blood of martyrs still stained the grass, when the wounds of schism were fresh, and the air trembled with prayers that had to be hidden in cellars. Her early years were Protestant by default, baptized under the Reformed Church, raised with Bibles in English, and a distrust of Latin. But even as a child, she noticed things: how her neighbors still lit candles on feast days behind shuttered windows, how some women clutched rosaries they pretended were heirlooms, not tools of worship, and how fear, in the absence of understanding, could sometimes look like faith. She did not rebel in anger. She wandered in curiosity. It was after her marriage to John Clitherow, a Protestant butcher and widower with children of his own, that Margaret began to shift. She had stepped into her new household with the grace of someone determined to be useful and obedient. Yet something in her moved differently, and the rhythm of the prayers she whispered at night no longer matched the rhythm of the church she attended on Sunday. Her conversion came quietly, not with fire and protest, but with hunger. She longed for something older, deeper, wrapped in incense and mystery. And so, one day, she entered the home of a Catholic woman, perhaps under the guise of visiting, perhaps with a different excuse, and she left that house with something new pulsing inside her, a longing that would never let her go. By the year 1574, she had officially converted, and everything changed. To be Catholic in Elizabethan England was not simply a personal act, it was an act of defiance. The state did not merely frown upon such faith, it hunted it. The Mass was banned. Priests were outlawed, forced to hide or flee. Anyone harboring them risked not only arrest but execution. It was a time when confession could mean your death, and communion was smuggled like contraband. And yet, instead of recoiling in fear, Margaret leaned closer. The more forbidden the faith became, the more fiercely she embraced it, as though something inside her refused to believe that truth could be chained by law. Her home soon became a haven not only for herself, but for others. It is said she built secret compartments into the walls to hide priests, that her children learned Latin prayers in the safety of a darkened kitchen, that she stored vestments and chalices beneath floorboards, and taught catechism to children with voices no louder than whispers. It was a small house, but it became, in its way, a cathedral of resistance, stitched together with silence and firelight, and the quiet knowledge that God might dwell in danger more than in safety. There were raids? Of course. Rumors always flowed faster than facts. The officials came knocking. Sometimes they found nothing. Sometimes they found books, or a crucifix, or the face of a priest too slow to disappear. Margaret was arrested more than once. Her husband, still Protestant, still loyal, paid fines that nearly ruined them. He begged her to be cautious. But Margaret had long stopped fearing poverty. The only thing that frightened her now was the idea of abandoning what she had already seen. Once a person touches the sacred, the world cannot return to ordinary. And yet, she was not angry. She did not rail against the Queen. She did not incite others to violence. Her rebellion was quieter, more subversive. She simply refused to pretend. She chose to believe, out loud and without apology, and to give shelter to those the state had turned into fugitives. And every time she was warned, every time someone told her to stop, she smiled with a sadness that said, "I have already counted the cost." You cannot frighten someone who has accepted her own death. But she did not die immediately. No. Her life stretched out across years of risk and whispered masses of children learning faith, as if it were a game of shadows and riddles, of candles blown out at the sound of horses on cobblestone. She lived in the tension between the sacred and the hunted, and as the law grew crueler, her resolve grew keener but deeper. By the year 1586, it had become too much. The net drew tighter. A search found what could no longer be denied. Margaret was arrested again, and this time, there would be no release. The authorities offered her a choice: plead guilty, or face a trial in which her children could be forced to testify against her. Margaret, always a mother before all else, chose neither. She said nothing. It is in that silence that her faith crystallized. Not in the sermons she heard or the prayers she spoke, but in that one final refusal to speak. In the face of power, she chose stillness. In the shadow of death, she chose not to run. Not because she wished for martyrdom, not because she was reckless, but because she believed, truly believed, that truth does not require screaming, and that love, real love, they would always choose the cross rather than abandon those it protects. And so, she lay in her cell, days before her death. Not with despair, but with clarity. She prayed, she prepared, she forgave. And when they told her what they would do to her, how they would break her, slowly, painfully, she asked only that a stone be placed beneath her back, so that her heart would be raised toward heaven. There is something in that gesture that outlives the centuries. Because this was never just about Margaret and the law. It was about the line between conscience and command, between belief and obedience, between what the world demands and what the soul cannot give up. And in that quiet little house in York, in a mother's heartbeat, in a woman's silence, the forbidden faith became not just a religion but a revolution. There are moments in a woman's life when even the silence in the floorboards begins to feel like a secret keeping watch. When the flicker of a candle becomes a question, and the whisper of wind against the shutters turns into the footsteps of someone who does not come in peace. And for Margaret Clitherow, life was not a string of calm days, but a house held together by prayers too quiet to protect, by shadows too faithful to flee, by the kind of tension that teaches you to breathe like a fugitive, even when you're simply folding linen or pouring water into a child's wooden cup. The raids never arrived with fanfare, never with warning, just the cold knock, the heavy boot against the stone, the creak of hinges that no longer asked permission, and suddenly the sacredness of home collapsed under the weight of suspicion. and the peace of a kitchen turned into the prelude to interrogation. And it didn't matter if your children were still in their nightclothes, or if the bread had only just begun to rise, because once they came inside, they searched everything. And everything meant everything. Floorboards, chimneys, attics, beds, cupboards, closets, holes in walls, backs of drawers, and even the eyes of your own children, looking back at you as if to ask whether they should lie like grown men or cry like lambs. Margaret had learned to live with this kind of terror, not because it became easier, but because she had long accepted that fear would be the price of faith in a country that feared what it could not control. And there was something almost holy in that rhythm, the way she trained her hands to work as if no one was watching, even though someone always was. The way she kept vestments wrapped beneath sheets of meat in the butcher's shop, or folded beneath the skirts of her daughter's doll, and the way she could lift a rug or loosen a floorboard in the dark without a sound. Because this was not a game. It was salvation disguised as domesticity. They searched her house more than once. It had become a pattern. Some neighbor with a tongue too eager or a conscience too clean would murmur something to the wrong ears. And then came the officials, clutching orders, eyes already believing guilt before proof. And Margaret would stand at the door with her hands folded, not in fear, but in stillness, because she had already decided, long ago, that she would not tremble for men who thought iron keys could open the soul. She never ran, even when she knew that a priest was hiding behind the wall she had built with her own hands, that a consecrated chalice lay inches below their feet, that her son had memorized prayers that could be used as evidence. She did not flee, did not scream, did not beg. She simply stood, and perhaps that was the thing they feared most about her, not her religion, not her defiance, but her stillness, because stillness like that does not come from ignorance. It comes from a fire that has already burned through doubt. There was one raid that changed everything. It began like the others, sudden and swift, with a rattle at the door and the echo of voices too sure of their authority. But this time, they were not just looking, they were hunting. Word had reached them. They said that Margaret Clitherow was hiding priests in her home and teaching children to pray in Latin. Someone had spoken, perhaps under threat, perhaps under guilt, perhaps just to save themselves. In times like those, betrayal was not rare. It was survival. The officials tore through the house with a violence that belied their mission. They lifted everything. They pulled apart walls. They kicked open chests. They questioned the children. And all the while, Margaret watched, not with anger, not with tears, but with that same unreadable stillness, as if she had long ago stopped expecting mercy from men who claimed to act in the name of law, but whose hands left fingerprints on the sacred. They found items, books, mostly Catholic texts, perhaps a small image of the Virgin, perhaps the corner of a vestment not fully hidden. Enough to accuse, not enough to convict, but Margaret knew that didn't matter. The truth, in such times, was not determined by facts, but by fear. And someone had decided that Margaret had crossed the line. The raid was not an investigation. It was a warning. And warnings, in that era, were not gentle. They took her again, not for the last time, not with ceremony, not with compassion. They dragged her from her home before her children. While the neighbors watched in that particular kind of silence that grows when people witness injustice but have grown too used to the taste of it to speak. And still Margaret did not resist. Because this, too, she had already seen. In her prayers, in her visions, in the quiet hours of the morning when the bells did not ring and the only sound was the rustle of parchment or the breath of a sleeping priest behind a wall, she had seen the day they would come for her, and she had not wept. For Margaret Clitherow, the raids were not just interruptions, they were rehearsals. Rehearsals for martyrdom, rehearsals for sacrifice. Rehearsals for the day she would no longer be able to protect the ones she loved unless she was willing to lay down her own life. And yet, that day had not come, not yet. She was released again. Somehow, perhaps because they lacked enough evidence, perhaps because her husband paid a fine, perhaps because the machinery of persecution had not yet decided to grind her bones. But it was clear now the net was tightening. The raids were no longer about searching. They were about waiting for a moment to strike. Margaret returned home. Not broken, but sharpened. She began to pray differently. Longer, softer. She lit candles not only for strength but for timing. She taught her children with even more care. And she began to prepare. Not for another raid, but for the end, because raids are not just events. They are signs. And Margaret Clitherow, whose faith was deeper than fear, knew how to read signs. There are moments in history when a woman says nothing, and yet the silence echoes louder than any cry. When the refusal to speak becomes the most defiant scream of all. And when the very act of stillness becomes the sword she draws not to wound, but to protect. And in the year 1586, Margaret Clitherow stood not in the middle of a battlefield, but inside the cold walls of an English courtroom, and instead of raising her hands in protest or falling to her knees in plea, she did the one thing the state could not predict. She chose silence. And in doing so, she chose to carry the weight of punishment alone, so that no child's lips would be forced to betray her. They had waited for this. The Crown had gathered its documents, its laws, its definitions of treason, so twisted in theology that belief had become crime and protection had become concealment. And now they stood, ready to make a spectacle of her, this mother, this butcher's wife, this soft-spoken woman who prayed in the wrong tongue and welcomed the wrong men into her home, and they expected her to bend like the others had, to beg, to cry, to explain herself, because that is what made it easier to destroy someone when they gave you a script and you helped them write it. But Margaret did not read from their page. She stood before the court, small and calm, and made of something the magistrates did not understand. And when asked to enter a plea to say whether she was guilty or not of hiding Catholic priests, of harbouring men who defied the Church of England, of keeping the old mass alive under the roof of her house, she said nothing, because if she spoke, they could bring in witnesses, and the only ones who had truly seen anything were her servants and her children, and she would not, could not, let them become instruments in her own destruction. So she remained silent, not with arrogance, not with contempt, but with the deep, unshakable clarity of a woman who had already chosen her cross, and who had no intention of letting anyone else bear even a splinter of its weight. The judges tried to provoke her. They said silence was guilt. They said the law required an answer. But Margaret knew the law, at least the law written in blood more ancient than theirs, and she knew that no earthly court had the right to demand she offer up the innocence of others to save herself. They could kill her, but they could not use her to harm the ones she loved. And so the trial became not a trial, but a standoff between power and principle. They could not proceed without a plea, and she would not give one. In the eyes of the Crown, that made her a traitor to the realm. In the eyes of the faithful, it made her a martyr in waiting. The sentence was automatic. To those who refused to plead, the punishment was not simply death. It was a death designed to coerce, to terrify, to break. Peine forte et dure, a phrase dressed in French but soaked in English brutality. It meant the pressing, it meant the weight, it meant the door, the stones. The slow, crushing pressure meant to force the plea from her lips, not for justice, but for theatre. But Margaret had rehearsed her part too well. In the days that followed her sentencing, she was not granted the dignity of long delay. They did not wait. They did not give her weeks to think, because they knew she would not change her mind. Instead, They locked her away in York Castle. She was given time only to pray, to fast, to prepare, and prepare she did not for reprieve, but for sacrifice. It is said she wrote letters in those final days. To her husband, to her children, to God. Her words were not bitter. She did not curse her captors. She did not blame her neighbors. She wrote of hope, of heaven, of forgiveness. She asked only that her death serve as witness, and that her family be spared from shame. And then came the morning. She was led to the place where they would carry out the sentence. Not a grand arena, not a square, but the old Tolbooth prison, dark and damp and low-ceilinged. She was made to lie down. A door was placed over her body, heavy and wide, pinning her still. And then, stone by stone, they began to load the weight. Iron weights, rough boulders, slabs of judgment wrapped in the silence of men, too afraid to face a woman who would not break. It is said she did not cry out, that the only thing she asked was that a sharp stone be placed beneath her back, so that her heart would be raised toward God. It is hard to imagine such a death, harder still to imagine choosing it, but Margaret Clitherow did not see it as choice-only consequence. She had lived according to a truth the law could not erase, and she would die with that truth intact. If that was what it demanded, she was crushed slowly. The bones broke, the breath shortened, the blood rose to her mouth, but still no cry, no plea, until, at last, silence returned to silence. And when they lifted the door from her body, the Crown believed it had silenced the woman, but it had only created a relic, a legend, a mother made into a monument, not of rebellion, but of conscience. Because Margaret Clitherow's trial was not really a trial, it was a mirror that showed England what it had become, a land where law feared love, where truth was tortured, and where silence had become the last language of the faithful. And in that silence, she left behind a legacy that not even stone could crush. There are punishments that exist not to cleanse a crime, but to perform a warning. Rituals of pain dressed as law. And Margaret Clitherow understood, in the final hours of her life, that she had become not merely a woman accused, but a stage upon which a kingdom would display its fear. That her body would be turned into a message for all those who still dared to pray in the old tongue, or to hide a priest behind a door. The weight prepared for her was not just stone and wood. It was the weight of a crown afraid of its own shadow. The weight of a law that could not tolerate conscience. The weight of a monarch's need to break what she could not convert. The cell at York was dim on the morning of her death. The air thick with damp. The light reluctant to come through the narrow window. As if even the sun did not wish to bear witness to what was about to unfold, Margaret knelt on the straw without trembling, her fingers moving over her rosary beads, not in haste, but with the rhythm of someone walking a road already known. Her lips moving in prayer so softly that even the guards, shifting uncomfortably at the door, could not catch the words. She had spent the night in vigil, not sleeping, not crying, simply breathing, readying her heart to be lifted, even as her body would be pressed down. They came without pomp, for this was not a spectacle meant for crowds but for silence, a punishment whose power lay in its hiddenness, a death carried out in a low chamber beneath the Tolbooth on Ouse Bridge rather than on a scaffold in the square. She was led down a narrow stair, barefoot, her hands bound loosely in front, a linen cloth o'er her head. No trumpets, no priest, no husband at her side. Only the officials, their faces hard not from hatred, but from the awkwardness of carrying out a sentence they had hoped to avoid, and a handful of witnesses required by law, watching with the stillness of men who knew they would be haunted. Margaret asked only one thing, that a sharp stone be placed beneath her back, so her heart would be raised toward heaven. It was a gesture as old as martyrdom, a sign that even in submission there could be intention. that even in the mechanics of death, she could shape the symbolism. They granted it, perhaps out of superstition, perhaps out of pity. She lay down, her arms extended like a cross, her palms open, her head turned slightly toward the window, where a sliver of light cut through the dark like a blade. Over her body, they laid a wooden door, heavy and broad, rough against her skin. The kind of door one might expect to keep out weather, not crush a human being. And then the wait began. At first a single stone, then another, each one a law, each one a decree, each one a fear turned solid and set upon her chest. The executioners moved mechanically, stacking the stones with care. As if the neatness of the arrangement could absolve them, Margaret's breath grew shorter, but she did not cry out. Her fingers tightened on the rosary. She whispered something no one heard. A guard turned away. Another crossed himself when he thought no one was looking. They say it took 15 minutes. 15 minutes in which the wait increased until ribs cracked and breath collapsed, and the line between pain and release blurred into a single point of surrender. 15 minutes in which Margaret Clitherow, mother and outlaw, became an icon without lifting a hand. 15 minutes in which silence spoke louder than any plea. And when it was over, they did not ring a bell or read a verdict. They lifted the stones, they removed the door, they covered her body quickly. As if speed could erase the intimacy of what they had done, they buried her quietly, without ceremony, in a secret grave to avoid veneration, believing that secrecy would contain her. But secrecy does not contain a story like Margaret's. The weight of the crown that killed her became the weight of memory that outlived it. Her silence became a sound in the hearts of those who heard. Her body, crushed into stillness, became a seed from which defiance grew. Even the officials, in their reports, could not hide their discomfort. Even her enemies whispered about her courage. Even her children, though orphaned by her choice, carried forward the knowledge that their mother had chosen to protect them above herself. And so the punishment backfired. What was meant to terrify became testimony. What was meant to erase became remembrance. The door meant to crush her heart became a door through which she entered history. Years later, when the persecution eased, her story returned like a tide. Pilgrims whispered her name. Hidden chapels told her tale, and in time, the church she had died for declared her a saint, canonizing her in the year 1984, lifting her name back into the light where no weight could reach it. But on that morning in York, none of this was known. There was only a small, dark chamber, a wooden door, a handful of stones, and a woman lying quietly beneath them, her heart raised toward heaven, even as her body was pressed into the earth, and a silence so deep it could not be crushed. There are deaths that end a life, and then there are deaths that begin a myth. And Margaret Clitherow's final hour did not pass like a flame being snuffed out, but like a candle laid gently on the altar, its wick still warm long after the light was gone, because her passing was not loud, not violent in the way that stories often demand, but instead, wrapped in the slow, suffocating quiet of conviction, a kind of stillness that does not beg for mercy or bargain with fear, but simply receives what is given and transforms it from punishment into purpose. The door was already in the room when they brought her in. Its rough wood leaned against the far wall like some ancient and silent witness. Its iron hinges rusted not from use but from waiting, because this was not the first time such a door had been used in England's long dance with conscience, but perhaps the first time it had been made sacred by the one beneath it. And as Margaret stepped across the threshold of that chamber beneath the toll booth, she did not look at the door as an object of terror, but as the final gate in her long journey of faith, a gate she would pass, not by opening it but by carrying it. The men around her did not shout. They did not mock. They did not spit as they might have, for some traitor or thief. Instead, They watched her move with such calm, such eerie grace, that a few of them looked away, not out of disgust, but out of the strange and terrible realization that they were about to do something holy in a way they did not understand. She lay down, without needing to be ordered, on the cold flagstones. She settled her body as if preparing for sleep, her dress straightened, her hands gently folded upon her stomach, her breathing steady. And when she asked quietly that a sharp stone be placed beneath her back, so that her heart might be lifted closer to God, no one argued, and one man knelt. Yes, knelt to find such a stone, and placed it beneath her shoulder blades. Not roughly, but with the care of someone placing the final relic into a tomb, and then they brought the door. It took 4 of them to lift it. Heavy oak, soaked with centuries, wider than a coffin, and thicker than any plank a house might use. And as they lowered it slowly down onto her chest, her body did not flinch. Her hands did not rise to stop them. Her lips did not part in protest. Only her eyes closed, as though welcoming a long-awaited shadow. The door settled onto her with a hollow thud. Then came the first weight. A stone, rough, cold, placed near her ribs. Then another, and another. The executioners, trained to be mechanical, found their breath slowing with each placement. The room growing quieter, not only from the absence of Margaret's voice, but from the deepening awareness that something irreversible was happening not just to her, but to them. Her chest rose and fell beneath the wood. Then it rose less. Then it barely rose at all. They say she whispered something, perhaps the name of Christ. Perhaps a prayer for her children. Perhaps nothing at all. But it was not loud. And it was not a plea. The stones kept coming. Each one meant to press out a confession. Each one meant to force the words, "I am guilty." But guilt does not live in silence. Guilt screams, bargains, weeps. Margaret did none of those things. She simply remained, and in that stillness, in that breathless resistance, she became heavier than the stones themselves. She became unbearable, not because her bones snapped, though they did, not because her lungs failed, though they did, but because she would not make it easier for them. She would not give them the relief of hearing her beg. She bore the weight not just of the door, not just of the stone, but of the entire machinery of fear that had crushed faith under royal decree, and she bore it with the same quiet strength with which she had opened her home to hunted priests, with which she had raised her children to know a God who did not wear a crown. And when at last her heart stilled, and the final breath curled like smoke through her lips, they lifted the door, and the room did not erupt with relief or vindication. It exhaled, as though holding that much weight, not just wood and stone, but shame had become unbearable, even for the walls. No bell was rung. No name was carved. Her body was taken away quickly, secretly, not to be honored, not to be remembered, but to be hidden. They feared she would become a symbol. They were right. For symbols are not made by thrones or courts or chronicles. They are born in rooms where no one looks directly at the horror. They are born in places like the chamber beneath the toll booth, where a woman met the crown with silence and turned the door, meant to crush her into a monument she carried into heaven. And though no plaque was nailed to that wall, though no hymn was sung in that moment, though no bishop came to bless the stones, the story walked out of that room in the mouths of every man who could not sleep after seeing her, in the heart of every child who asked why his mother prayed behind a locked door, in the tremble of every guard who had to carry the final stone, because Margaret Clitherow died beneath the door. But she did not die beneath silence. She made the silence hers, and in doing so, made it sacred. They say the room was never the same after that morning, not because of blood, for there was remarkably little of it, nor because of screams, for none were uttered, but because silence has a residue, and when it comes from a soul refusing to break, it clings to the air like incense that cannot be scrubbed out. and the straw upon which Margaret Clitherow had lain was never quite clean again, no matter how often it was swept or replaced or burned, as though it remembered the shape of her body and refused to forget. The toll-booth room beneath Ouse Bridge remained dark, and no prisoners were kept there for some time. Not because it was officially condemned, but because the men who once patrolled it now crossed themselves when walking past the threshold. And though none spoke of hauntings in the way, common folk spoke of wailing spectres or flickering lights. There was a different kind of haunting there, one made not of shadows, but of presence, a breathless pressure in the lungs, a heaviness in the bones, as though some part of the weight that crushed Margaret had settled into the stone walls and now pressed upon everyone who entered. The straw was new, but it always smelled old, damp, thick with memory. And when fresh prisoners were eventually kept there, vagrants, debtors, dissenters, they said, odd things in the morning that they had heard the sound of beads clicking together in the dark, that they had felt a door creaking above them, though no hinges moved, that they had seen no ghost, but dreamed of a woman kneeling. Her fingers folded. Her spine arched painfully against something unseen. Margaret was not buried in state. There was no procession, no monument, no marker. Her body, broken and hidden, was placed in secret earth, far from the reach of relic seekers and faithful mourners, and yet the story moved anyway, carried not by parchment or proclamation, but by whisper, by candlelight in private chapels, by mothers telling daughters, by priests in exile, invoking her name as quiet reassurance that the faith could endure anything, even doors and stones. Her husband, John, returned to a home not empty but echoing. 3 children, now motherless, looked to a man hollowed by grief. And yet even he who might have cursed the church for its cost, or the Queen for her cruelty, held his silence, or perhaps could only speak in the same tone Margaret had shown, soft, steady, unyielding. He never remarried. He raised their children in the same faith that had killed their mother. And so the legacy did not shout. It settled. It endured. It haunted. The priest she had harbored that winter, the one whose hiding place had triggered the arrest, escaped. He lived. And in time, he told her story in detail to others, wrote it down for safekeeping. And though the tale passed through many hands and many tongues, it retained the one element that no one could explain away: that Margaret had not fought, had not cursed, had not begged, but had walked into her death as if into a chapel, and laid herself down beneath the door like an offering. York changed, not in its laws, not yet, but in its conscience. The men who had authorized the sentence did not do so again. Some grew sick. One died within the year, though no one spoke openly of judgment. And the women of the town, those who had wept in silence when Margaret was led away, began to light candles when no one was looking. And though her name was not carved, it was murmured in prayers. She became not a martyr sanctioned by Rome, not yet, but a ghost of conscience, the kind that stands behind you when you decide whether to lie, the kind that lingers at the edge of the bed when you close your eyes and wonder what you would do if it were your turn to speak or to remain silent. And so Margaret's ghost did not rattle chains. She did not howl. She prayed. And those who claimed to feel her presence said that it was never frightening, only heavy, as though the air itself remembered the weight she had borne, as though holiness could leave fingerprints. And when, years later, the ban on Catholicism softened, when the fires no longer burned and the doors no longer crushed, when the monarchy turned its eye elsewhere, Margaret's name did not vanish with the fear it grew, not loudly, but certainly, like a seed in deep earth. In the quiet places of England, her story was told, not with fire and fury, but with warmth, with a slow ache, with awe, and eventually, centuries later, a pope read her story and wept. In the year 1984, Margaret Clitherow, wife, mother, outlaw, ghost, was declared a saint. But by then, she had already been canonized by the straw, by the door, by the weight that had failed to silence her, long before the bells of Rome ever echoed her name, long before the silver tongues of bishops smoothed her story into sainthood. Margaret Clitherow lived on in the slow, hidden rituals of the people who whispered her memory, not in churches, but in kitchens, not in Latin, but in the breath between lullabies and warnings. Because history, you see, does not always keep its promises. But memory, especially the kind passed from hand to hand, in the dark, never forgets the ones who bled quietly. They did not need paintings. They did not need relics. All they needed was the silence she left behind, in the houses where the curtains stayed drawn. Mothers began pressing their palms gently against the chests of their daughters when they prayed, not to crush, but to remind them of the weight one woman had carried without flinching. And in that gesture, repeated over soup pots and wash basins and beds tucked in against frost, Margaret's body became a prayer that moved without words, a gesture that asked, softly, would you do the same? There were no statues in the market square, but there was a woman who wore her apron longer than usual, because Margaret had worn hers long enough to conceal secret doors in the floor. There were no hymns with her name in them, but there was an old man who always kept an extra piece of bread near the edge of the table, because Margaret had fed priests with broken crusts, while the city watched, and there were no feast days, no candles in stained glass windows, but there was a girl who, every time she passed beneath Ouse Bridge, would press her hand against the cool stones of the toll booth wall, not knowing exactly why, but certain deep in her bones that someone had once laid down there and turned pain into something holy. In those first generations after her death, Margaret was not called saint. She was called the one who would not speak, and that, more than any sermon, carved itself into the marrow of the faithful, because in a world where women were told to obey, told to serve, told to disappear, Margaret's silence was not weakness, it was thunder. She had refused to name names, and so she became the name that needed no naming. They told her story not in pulpits, but in kitchens, during the folding of linens, while kneading dough, while brushing a child's hair back from fevered brows. The mothers called her our girl, the daughters called her the brave one, and when the men were drunk or angry or afraid, the women simply looked to the floor, to the hearth, to the place where fire and faith lived quietly, and remembered Margaret, who did not raise her voice, but raised the weight instead. As years passed, her name became a code. In times of crackdown, when books were burned and priests dragged from homes, when the crown tightened its grip again, Margaret's story was tucked into the corners of embroidery, into the margins of cookbooks, into the rhyme of nursery songs, where kings could not hear and daughters would not forget. There was one song, barely more than a whisper, that the children would hum while skipping stones by the river, stone upon stone. But none on the bone, for silence speaks louder than throne. No one knew who wrote it. No one needed to. It was Margaret's, even in exile, among the English who had fled to France or the Low Countries or beyond. Her story travelled like a breath behind a locked door. She was never canonized in those whispers. She was crowned, not with gold, but with grief, with quietness, with the slow unfolding of reverence that does not need permission. The priests who survived the hunt for recusants spoke of her with their heads bowed, not as martyr, not even as sister, but as mother, because Margaret had been more than one woman under one door. She had been the womb of a church that refused to die. They said, she bore the future while the past tried to crush her. They said, she was not broken, so we must not bend. And every time a priest took confession in secret, he remembered Margaret, Every time a boy was taught the Latin Mass in whispers, he remembered Margaret. Every time a girl dared to keep a crucifix hidden beneath her bodice, she remembered Margaret. And Margaret remembered them too, not in ghostly visitations, but in the steady, invisible way the holy make themselves known. A breeze where there should be none. A dream that lingers longer than it should. A sudden stillness in a room full of noise. Margaret was not a queen. She had no army. She ruled no court. But she sat on the throne of resistance that no monarch could unseat. Her relics were not bones. They were glances exchanged over candlelight. They were acts of mercy done without names. They were children taught that silence, when done in truth, is the loudest sermon. It would take centuries for Rome to catch up. And even when they did, when the bishops stood in robes to finally call her saint, they were merely echoing what the poor had already known. Margaret had never needed their words. She had already become the prayer they had all been praying. She had been canonized, not in cathedrals but in kitchens, not with Latin but with lullabies, not by decree, but by devotion. She was the saint in the shadows. And that, perhaps, is the holiest kind. And now, dear listener, let us close the door gently behind us. Let us dim the lanterns of memory and draw the curtain across the last flicker of stone and straw. Not to forget, but to rest, for the story of Margaret Clitherow was never meant to end in a cage or under a door. Never meant to remain pressed beneath the weight of law or silence or time, but to rise, slowly and quietly, through the generations, until it found you here, listening, breathing, wondering what it means for someone to refuse to bend. She was not made of steel. She was not born a legend. She was a woman of linen and breath, of children's laughter and warm hands, of ordinary love and quiet prayer. And when the world asked her to betray those she held dear, she answered, not with fury, not with swords, but with a silence so full it shook the heavens. They tried to break her. They crushed the ribs that once rose to kiss the laughter of her children. They crushed the hands that once folded bread for a hungry priest. They crushed the heart that once beat steady beneath the weight of a forbidden cross. But they did not break her, because what they crushed was flesh. What they could never reach was faith. And faith, my friend, is made not of stone or law or even blood, but of something lighter and heavier all at once. Like the way her name was passed in secret from one mouth to another. Like the way her prayer slipped beneath the door when no one was watching. Like the way her silence still echoes in the rooms we keep locked inside our own lives. Perhaps you too have known a door, a wait, a silence. Perhaps there has been a moment in your life when you were asked to give up what was sacred just to be safe. Maybe you kept quiet when it cost you. Or maybe, like Margaret, you chose not to speak. Not because you were afraid, but because your silence meant someone else could live. And so, as you lie back now, as the shadows stretch long and the world hushes its breath, know this, you are not alone. She is here, not as a ghost, not even as a saint, but as a quiet rhythm in the stillness of your chest, a reminder that not all strength shouts. Some of it kneels, some of it prays, some of it simply endures. So rest now, beneath no weight, but the softness of this moment. Let the straw hold you, not as prison, but as cradle. Let the story wrap around you like warm cloth. And if ever the night feels heavy again, if ever the world presses in too close, remember her name. Margaret, the woman who lay down and did not break. Good night.